able to offer it. I wanted to also mention that we are recording this training. Lots of people who could not make it today wanted to be able to have access to the information, so we are recording, just so that you know that. And as we go along, we expect that this will be very interactive. So please either put your questions in the chat or let us know if you want to ask your question live. We'll go ahead and facilitate that. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our trainer for this morning. Jabril Touré has been organizing for greater police accountability as a member of Malcolm X grassroots movement and other coalitions for about 20 years. Having worked on issues of selective enforcement / discriminatory policing, he was part of 2 lawsuits against the New York Police Department and its stop and frisk programs, 2 cases, Daniels versus the NYPD in 2001, and Floyd versus the NYPD in 2012. He has worked in coalition with the Coalition Against Police Brutality and Communities United for Police Reform on long-term recommendations and solutions for public safety. So, Jabril, we're excited to have you.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. I'm looking forward to having this discussion and hopefully, answering questions for people who have maybe had this experience or just had thoughts about, what's going on currently in our society. But, I come to this from an understanding of, police brutality that really started a long time ago. Even in my youth, my parents were involved in marching against apartheid and things like that. And after graduating from college at Cornell University, I got involved in several organizations that were doing human rights work in the African American community. One of those was the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And one of the incidents that really, I guess, inspired me to become involved in this work was the Amadou Diallo situation that happened in New York, where basically Amadou Diallo was an unarmed man, who was just really returning home one evening, after feeding his family and kind of doing his daily work, and was basically approached by officers. They asked him to raise his hands. An incident occurred where they thought that he might have had a weapon, and he ended up being shot 41 times. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the history of New York City, but this is one of the incidents that really kind of shocked people and brought people out, because in a sense he was such an innocent person, and to see what happened to him in to somebody who was really unarmed, kind of highlighted the fact that we need to really start looking at policing in New York. And after doing this work for several years, again, I've been involved in a couple of lawsuits around what was considered stop, question, frisk. That was a policy in New York, which I think most of you are aware. Stop and frisk is something that police sort of have a right to do anytime they feel that someone is a threat, or anyone is, kind of, in a situation where people have made a complaint about them. But it doesn't include them having the full rights to stop and question Black and Latino people as they have done. And so, maybe I usually, when I start these discussions, we sort of go back historically and talk about how we got to this place. And so if you'll give me a minute, I'm not going to take too long, but, really a lot of this started under the Giuliani administration, as far as labeling officers as street crimes unit, and allowing sort of officers to go without wearing uniforms, going out and looking at drug crimes and violent crimes. In a sense, in the sense of these officers are not wearing uniforms and they're undercover officers. And this was something that was really pushed by the Giuliani administration as a means of fighting crime. And one of the reasons they use for justifying this was called CompStat. So CompStat is basically a philosophy where they basically said every community can be labeled statistically by the numbers of crimes that are happening. And so you look at burglaries, you look at robberies, you look at auto thefts, and you can create a graph for these communities, right? Um, that was called CompStat, and it was basically a way of looking at crime in the city and applying resources to those areas. Um, Basically, a lot of people started to believe that CompStat was a very effective way of applying police resources, because basically you're looking at, graphical stats, and it seems very easy to see that if there's 15% rise in burglaries in one neighborhood, then maybe you need to put more people there. So the problem with that is that a lot of the enforcement came from rookie officers. Some of them were placed in communities under special programs. So you have programs, for instance, in New York, they have what are called operations. And if I'm going too fast, please feel free to ask me to go back or review anything. But in New York, they have operations. So for instance, they had Operation Spotlight. Operation Spotlight was basically around people being active in the night. They have Operation Clean Sweep, which was around people who were littering, people who were kind of loitering in the street, or homeless people. And they have various different operations, right? They actually had Operation Empty Bag. I always give an example of this operation because literally this is a case where the NYPD would put an empty bag with money in it in public places. And if somebody were to come along and find this bag, that person could be arrested and face criminal charges. This is some of the things that New York kind of would do to kind of stop crime. And, people would obviously look at that and say, like, are you, dragging people into a crime, but, those are questions that are legal, that have been challenged over the years as far as different enforcement methods. But basically, during CompStat, a lot of people believe that this was an appropriate way of applying police resources. And so you had a lot of neighborhoods where you started to see unequal enforcement, right? And by that, I mean that if you were to live in Park Slope, or if you were to live in, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, you probably wouldn't notice that there are police officers kind of checking and stopping people on the regular, because it wasn't really an occurrence as much in these neighborhoods. If you lived in Harlem, if you lived in Brooklyn, in East New York, in Jackson Heights, these are areas where police were basically given the right to stop, question, and frisk anybody that they viewed as somewhat suspect. And in some cases, they really didn't have to have very much suspicion in order to stop somebody. The person could just be walking down the street. So I experienced this because, around the time of Amadou Diallo, which was 1999, and this is after Giuliani actually wasn't mayor anymore. Bloomberg became mayor and sort of expanded the idea of stop, question, and frisk. I started to have experiences in my neighborhood where I was being stopped, and I felt that, going out at night, even like 10, 11 o'clock at night, I felt like uncomfortable. I felt like, these police officers are here looking for me. Why do I feel this uncomfort? And I basically noticed that this was happening to a lot of my community, where people really felt like they were not really comfortable walking out in the streets. You had individuals being stopped really for any reason. And my first experience was really, as a musician, I was also doing music at the time as far as organizing. I was stopped by 4 officers on Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn. And I literally just had my guitar with me because I was coming from a studio. And I was basically in a position where 4 officers rode past me in an undercover vehicle. They stopped for, maybe 2 seconds and then rode back a block. And so, I'm a little curious as to why these officers are stopping me, what they're interested in. And they, kind of surrounded me. It was four large officers. They said, get on the wall and do you have anything? You know? And so I'm like wondering, like, what do you mean? Do I have anything? What exactly are you asking me? Did I do anything wrong? At that point, the officer said, do you have ID? And I questioned, why should I show you ID if I haven't done anything? What's this about? Um, the officer's response at that time was basically, if you don't have ID, you're going to go to jail. And, you need to show us ID right now. Um, I felt that there was something wrong with this, right? But at the time, I didn't really have any instruction on how to respond to a police incident. I didn't know what my rights were in that situation. And so, like a lot of people, I provided them with my identification. I gave them my wallet, which they searched fully. And then they searched inside of my jacket. They searched inside of my pockets, which, again, at that time, I felt like there was something wrong with this. I knew that there was something sort of improper with how they were treating me. But um, as a regular person going through society, you haven't necessarily had these incidents. So that's one of the reasons why we kind of wanted to talk about this, to sort of break down what every incident is when you have a police encounter, and what you can do to protect yourself in each of those incidents. So basically, yeah, after that incident, the police officers searched me fully, and when they were leaving, they said, when a cop tells you what to do, you better do it, you know? And that was one of the things that kind of triggered me. It sort of put me in the place of realizing, like, this is a real problem in society that we need to get concerned about and start organizing. And again, thankfully, I was part of an organization that was doing a lot of work. We were doing a lot of work around political prisoners at the time, and we sort of got involved in the issue around police justice around Amadou Diallo. And so after that incident, we really came together as a group of organizations. We had Latino organizations, we had African American organizations, we had LGBT organizations, all basically come to the table and describe their incidents with police and the different ways that police are interacting with those communities. And one thing we learned is that basically the police have different interactions with different people. So in the LGBT communities, we found that a lot of folks, a lot of times people of color even, were being stopped at Chelsea Piers in New York, which was a common gathering place for, LGBT, gay, Black folks who were just gathering, and basically found that the police were stopping young Black and Latino men more often than anybody else, even in those settings. In the Asian communities in New York, we experienced situations where cops would come into Asian communities and wouldn't understand the particulars of how the youth are treated. And we had situations where youth were arrested. There was one youth who was actually killed in New York, Yang Jin Wan, who's it's mentioned in our workshop. But one of the things we found is that the police act very differently when they come to these communities. And a lot of it is about the instructions that they're given, which goes back to, the cop watch situation, or rather comp stat. So in general, I'm trying to sort of bring this all together, and feel free to ask any questions if people have. But we started organizing as a coalition in early 2000s around issues of stop, question, and frisk. And we started the first lawsuit then, which was actually NYPD versus Daniels. That lawsuit was basically to question NYPD for the illegal behavior of its officers, and to say that, the fact that you're stopping 85 to 90% of only Black men in a society indicates that you're running a discriminatory program. You're running a program that's actually selectively enforcing stop, question, and frisk only on Black and Latino people. And during that lawsuit, we were able to bring examples of people who had been stopped. You know, we were talking about Amadou Diallo, but we were also talking about regular New Yorkers and their experiences. And some of those experiences were very violent. You know, you had people who, because of a disagreement with the police, ended up being arrested. Some of them were physically abused. You had incidents where people were shot, you know, in a lot of cases in New York. Patrick Dorismond was a case of, you know, someone who was shot by an NYPD officer after the officer asked him for drugs, you know. So, you know, in going through these cases, NYPD basically had to admit that it had a problem. So after the Daniels lawsuit was filed, which was in 1999, NYPD kind of admitted that it had a problem, and it agreed to make certain changes to its policing system. It agreed to not stop people based on race, gender, ethnicity, age, religious background, all those sorts of things. And it made some changes in its police handbook. But what we experienced over the next 10 years, from 2000 all the way up to 2011, is that stop, question, and frisk actually increased. It went from, in our first year, which was in 2000, we had about 100,000 cases, maybe even a little bit less than 100,000 cases of people who were stopped and felt that they were, you know, wrongly stopped, people who actually made complaints. And some of those complaints were filed with the NYPD. One of the things I like to mention is that the NYPD actually has a form they use. It's called a UF 250. And these officers are supposed to write, when they stop somebody, they're supposed to write what was the reasoning for the stop, you know, what the results of that stop were, if they arrested the person, if they didn't arrest the person, and if there are any further comments, right? But they're supposed to make a record of these stops. Part of the problem in New York is that they often don't record these stops. New York officers are allowed to talk to you. They're allowed to sort of, you know, instigate a conversation with you without really having the right to. They can come up to you and say, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? And, you know, sort of just initiate a conversation. A lot of times that conversation might lead to them asking questions. And later on, if that person doesn't answer those questions correctly, they can end up being stopped or you know, even arrested. So the New York City Police Department doesn't always record all of those UF 250s. And so people have a lot of these incidents where, you know, these things are not being recorded. So the first year that we sued the NYPD for stop, question, and frisk, we found that there were about 100,000 people being stopped. As it went further, you know, over time, we found that it actually went up to about 700,000 people a year in 2011, which were basically Black and Latino people that were being stopped. And 90% of those stops didn't involve any arrest, didn't involve any kind of ticket, you know. So these were people that were basically innocent. They hadn't, you know, there was no further police follow-up, yet they had had these stops where they were stopped, questioned, frisked. And so what we did is we actually took them back to court in 2012. And we had another lawsuit which basically said that, you know, if the city doesn't make these changes that they were supposed to make as far as how they were policing certain communities, that we would have the right to take them back to court, which we did in 2012. We were part of an organization that was called the Center for Constitutional Rights. People should look up that organization because they do a lot of very progressive legal work. But Center for Constitutional Rights was the organization that actually brought Floyd versus NYPD versus Floyd. And what happened with that case was that we again presented a number of cases where people were stopped illegally, their rights were violated, and you know, these officers basically were not punished. And you know, what at the end of the lawsuit, NYPD was found basically guilty of running a selective discriminatory program, which was stop, question, and frisk. And as a result, they had to make certain changes, legal changes, which one of them was required an independent prosecutor, which we actually now have over the NYPD. We have an independent prosecutor. I believe it's the same person. His name was Daniel Ure, to actually make changes. And so what an independent prosecutor is supposed to do is actually review the records of the police department. Each precinct is supposed to have an internal control officer that sort of sends over records of what the police department does. And the independent prosecutor is supposed to go over those records and to offer changes. And so when you see things like, the chokehold ban, which was one of the things folks have been debating about lately, should officers have the right to apply a chokehold to someone, even if a person is in distress? These are things that the independent prosecutor has had some say over. The independent prosecutor has also managed the aspect of body cams. So very recently, I guess in the last 5 years, officers have had to use body cams in a lot of states and cities. Some of this is required by the states because of legal challenges, in a lot of these cases. Like for instance, during the Obama era, there was an active Justice Department which actually required some of these cities to instigate some of these changes after there was legal investigations, especially in New York, in Louisiana, in Los Angeles, I believe in DC, but a number of states which had issues around discriminatory policing. The feds came in and basically said, you have to start making these changes. And so some of those things were like body cameras, and there's some other changes which I may be forgetting, but there was sort of a structure in place to start dealing with police that are out of control, and it came from a lot of organizing on the street level, a lot of grassroots organizing here in New York and other places, but also on the federal level, right? And some of that is being challenged now. Most of us are aware that the current administration has a different strategy as far as federal policing, as far as investigating officer misconduct. The feds, the FBI, or rather the US government in general, decided to stop these investigations of a lot of police departments. Which were happening under the Obama administration as a result of, a lot of incidents like Trayvon Martin and things like that. So they decided to go in a different direction. And so what we're seeing now is, to some extent, a resurgence of these incidents like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain is one of the cases that a lot of people have been talking about very recently. And the thing about Elijah McClain's case, this is a young man who was, had an incident with the police. They tried to get him to stop, and for whatever reason, he didn't stop, and it turned into a physical situation. And he had pressure applied to his body, his neck, and he ended up passing away. This case never came out in the media, right? We literally are just finding out about a lot of these cases because there was a time when we kind of, for whatever reason, didn't have the media coverage of a lot of these incidents that are happening. But one thing I should let people know is that these things are a regular occurrence in our society. People having regular incidents where they're unarmed. A lot of times people, sometimes in mental distress, who just, for whatever reason, end up being deceased because of a police encounter.
Debril, there's a question in the comments.
Yes.
Somebody would like to know, Sandra's son would like to know if the police were and are stopping people of their own color? So are all cops white is basically that question.
The police officers who are stopping
Yes.
come from different communities. So a lot of times, well, in the past in New York, we had a situation where a lot of the officers come from outside of the 5 boroughs. And so you had officers from Long Island, you have officers from Queens and Staten Island, you know, places that are not from the, you know, the inner city areas. And a lot of times those officers wouldn't have the experience in dealing with communities. So they don't know, you know, how to tell if a person is dressed as a gang member or if a person is just having fun. They would see a person wearing a blue bandana and assume that that person is in a gang. They have, you know, means of targeting people based on their appearance and sort of profiling. You know, one of the things we'll talk about is profiling and what does a profile mean. But in general, I would say that officers who are stopping people and sometimes even are discriminatory come from different backgrounds. You have African-American officers who sometimes feel that they need to prove to their associates that they're tough on crime, and so they're extra aggressive when they're encountering somebody. You know, you have white officers who may not understand the community and don't understand why somebody is talking so loud and feel that they have to be extra aggressive. You know, there are judgments that are made in policing, and that's something that we all understand. You know, anytime an officer has to make a judgment, a lot of it comes from their mental perspective, how they think about things. And I'll just say that it goes across the board. I wouldn't say that it's only white officers. You know, it's more of a systemic thing where officers are taught to look at themselves as a group and the people that they're policing as the enemies in some situation, or the people that they're in conflict with, you know, and the way that they approach that situation leads us to where we are now. So I hope that was answering the question. Usually what I like to do with this is start off by asking a few questions of people here. And one of the things we usually ask is how many people, I guess it's hard here because we don't have a room where everybody can show their hand, but I wanted to just ask how many people have ever had a police encounter, and if people could raise their hands. Okay. So it looks like a lot of people have had a police encounter. I'm able to see about 5 or 7. I wanted to ask our administrator, should we have a chance where people can discuss what their encounter was with the police? Like if there are folks who are part of this group that want to maybe offer or discuss, I wanted to give them that opportunity so we can make it more of a discussion. If anybody has anything or any incidents they've had with the police, maybe a car stop, maybe they were at a protest, anything like that that you want to share is fine. Just wanted to leave that space open. Anybody? Yes, I see Darcy.
Darcy, unmute yourself first.
Okay, so mine was quite a while ago, and it was in Washington, D.C. My sister and I were coming from a party, 2 white girls, young, and we, I guess, ran the red light, or it was kind of yellow, kind of red, and we got stopped, and because we had been drinking, we weren't drunk. I was still okay to drive, but the police took us to the police station and had us sit in a room with a lot of more serious people coming and going. And so we were observing what was going on. And on the table in front of us were all these urine samples. And the cop said, just sit here for a while, we'll get to you in a minute. And they never came back to us. We never had to, I think they knew that that would scare us enough. But we were talking about it the other day. My sister still lives in DC, and we were saying perhaps if we had been African American, we wouldn't have been given the benefit of the doubt. So they scared us.
Okay.
They did take us in, so it wasn't blown off.
Okay.
But there was no procedural follow-up. It was like,
Right.
You guys get it? So to me, that was more of the white privilege of getting the benefit of the doubt.
Okay. I appreciate that. And, you know, one of the things that I usually try to discuss here is the history of it, meaning that, you know, we have to look at how policing happens and that there's an economic, you know, means to policing. One of the reasons why people get stopped so often in the city is because of, you know, the money that's being made, you know, and a lot of people refer to it as what's called a prison industrial complex, right? And so when I say that, it just goes to say that a lot of money is being raised by giving out tickets, by stopping people for, you know, driving through traffic lights, for littering, for jaywalking, for all those sorts of things. And it varies depending on where you live. But private prisons, you know, and the funding is a real issue. And a lot of times when people get arrested in the city, it's really because the police have quotas. You know, they're given instructions on how many people they have to stop for parking by the stoplight, parking at a bus stop. They're given instructions on how many transit, you know, folks they have to stop when people are jumping turnstiles. So there are guidelines for police on how many people they have to stop. And, you know, that's a controversial issue because people are like, why should the police have, you know, quotas on how many people they're stopping? It should just be like, you should observe whatever people are doing. If somebody's doing something wrong, you know, you tell them, you know, to change their action or whatever. And if they don't, maybe give them a ticket. But a lot of this has to do with policing. In your case, and I've been in a similar situation to you. Depending on how you handle the situation, cops have given me a pass when they could have given me a ticket. You know, I was with a friend. We made probably a left turn where we shouldn't have, and, you know, had cops stop us and sort of say, you know, why did you guys turn there? Oh, excuse me, officer, I didn't realize, you know, I've done this a bunch of times. I think they just put that sign there, and the officers say, okay, you know what, this is your first time, I'll let you guys go. A lot of that is how you handle the situation, but some of it may be based on their prejudices also. They might have looked at someone as, you know, this is an older white woman, we don't need to cause any trouble. We don't need her to complain against us or to file any
Turn into a
things.
Karen.
Yeah, and so sometimes that happens where they just don't want any trouble. And a lot of times in our communities, they feel that they have the right to do whatever because they feel like in Black communities, people may not have that history of knowing their rights. People don't know how to handle a police encounter, so they'll tell you to do anything. I've seen situations where the police are arresting or abusing someone and people are videotaping and the cop is like, turn their camera off. You know, that's actually illegal. The cops are pretty much aware that we have the right to observe, to witness anything they're doing, and it's legal. It's hardly ever been challenged in court. I think someone tried to challenge the police being videotaped once, but it's universally established that you as an individual have the right to observe the police. But there are times where they'll tell you to do this or to do that, which is why for me it's important that everybody knows their rights, because they take advantage of that fact, you know, of lower income communities, certain communities where people just, for whatever reason, people might have immigration issues and feel like, all right, you know what, I can't say anything even though the cops abused me because, you know, my green card status is, you know, in a certain situation. So they take advantage of that. And so that's why we have to, you know, spread the information that you do have rights. You know, if a cop tells you to do this and you're uncomfortable with what they're telling you, there are questions you can ask. You know, there are things you can do to clarify what the situation is.
So there's another question in the comments. Nicole is asking for if you can clarify that the right to observe, videotape, etc., because it's happening in a public place.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
then we also
I can
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I can just interject and say, I was just hoping to gain a little more clarity on if it's because it's a public place, or if there's a difference if it's in a private place, say a home, regardless of who's the owner or whatnot.
My understanding is, I'm not a lawyer, but I've worked with a lot of lawyers. My understanding is that as officers who are employed, either by the state or the city, that their job is public. The services that they provide are public service, and they are basically in a situation where they can't stop you from videotaping, because what they're doing is basically a public service. And so, they can't say that you were illegally recording them. Now, if they are, let's say an officer is off duty and is in their private space, they get into their private vehicle, you might not be able to record them in that situation, because now they're a private person. But as long as they're doing a public role, you have the right to videotape, record. Yeah.
Thanks.
And
That's
then-
really helpful to know. Back
And
to you,
the reason why
Allison.
that was challenged actually is because there was a case several years ago in Illinois where a guy basically witnessed the police beating someone across the street. I think he was behind a vehicle, and he recorded it without the officers knowing. It wasn't one of the cases where, somebody came up and said, "Oh, this is wrong, I'm going to record." He recorded from a distance, and the officers tried to challenge it in court and say they were illegally recorded. This person videotaped us without our knowledge. And the courts universally have said these were public events. You're employed as an officer of, the state, and we have the right. And so it's been rejected every time they've tried to challenge it. So that's one of the powers we have. And honestly, it's one of the main powers. If you look at the George Floyd situation, if you look at Rodney King, which was the first one that I really remember, was the Rodney King situation when I was in college, and the turmoil that created. I mean, even on a college, I was at Cornell University, and we almost had a huge fight because we were angry about Rodney King, and people were like throwing beer at us, because we were singing the national anthem and protesting. So these incidents have happened for a long time, and it's based on a lot of times videotape. It's based on our observation of what these officers are actually doing. And so, later on, I'll talk more about Cop Watch, but we actually started an organization called Cop Watch. This was during the height of the Stop, Question, and Frisk era. And so many people were being stopped and having incidents, people who were professionals, doctors, lawyers were getting stopped, that we basically started training people on how to go out in their community with a video camera. In teams, we would go out in teams of like maybe 5 to 7 people, maybe in 2 vehicles, and just observe what the police are doing. If we saw something going on that was wrong, we would let them know, look, we're here with community organization, and we're just watching out. If people feel like they need this video for their legal protection or whatever, we basically would give them that video. So there were incidents where we saw people being stopped, frisked, and sometimes the cops would see us come up with video cameras and would instantly leave. They would just hop back in their cars and leave. And it was amazing sometimes. We're like, wow, how did that happen? And, there were, later on, maybe if I can find some video, you'll see people cheering, because there were people who were just literally outside of their house talking, and all of a sudden these undercover officers come up and start searching everybody. So that was accepted for a long time, that, oh, this is how you make the city safer. But it actually made it less safe for 85% of our residents, and we, again, we started going into all of the details, and looking at the police encounters is important. So I usually start with talking about the 4 levels of police encounters, and I'm just going to go through those for a minute, because usually what happens is police are given the freedom to interact with everybody. When a police officer walks down the street, a lot of people will talk to them. There are people who don't have a problem with communicating and saying hi to police officers. They often talk to people. Officers will say, "Hey, how you doing? what's going on, any kind of thing like that. So officers are basically allowed to talk to anyone. Same way like anyone in society is allowed to have a conversation. But you don't have a responsibility to continue a conversation with an officer. And sometimes they use that power to try to get information. So an officer might say something like, hey, how's it going today? And then they might say, well, I heard there was a shooting around here. Did you see which way the guys went? Which is kind of an innocent question to some people. It's just like, all right, I heard there was a shooting. Did anybody see anything? But the problem with that is that you're now being asked to offer information. And if you give the wrong information, you could put yourself in some kind of legal jeopardy, right? If you say, I saw 5 guys, and the officer says, which way did they go? And you're like, I don't feel comfortable answering that. They could say, maybe you were part of it. Maybe you were an accomplice. These things sort of happen when people start to answer questions. And so I always first start by telling people that you really don't have to answer an officer's questions unless they have justification for stopping you. So if an officer indicates, all right, I need you to wait here, or I need you to show me some ID, that's a different type of stop than an officer just having a verbal kind of back and forth with you, right? So usually what we call the first level of a police encounter is called approach or common law right to inquire, right? This is like basically the most basic level of police encounter. What it means is that for some reason, the cop feels like they have the right to basically approach you or to ask, what you're doing, maybe to ask for ID. Typically, this happens when you're doing something that the police see that could be a violation or maybe a misdemeanor. So let's say the police see you in a group in front of a store. There's like 8 people in front of a store, everybody's talking. They could consider that to be loitering, right? It doesn't mean that you're actually loitering, but they could be looking at that and saying, maybe these people are loitering. Maybe if they see people in front of a private building, they could say these people are trespassing, Not saying, again, that these people are definitely doing these things, but these are the reasons that police might initiate what's called an approach or common law inquiry, right? So an example I give is like, kids leave a store or they leave school and they go to a store. This is something that happens a lot, right? 10 kids go to a store buying candy or whatever. The police might see that and say, hey, you know what? I need to stop them and ask what they're doing or ask them for ID. And in those instances, they might have a justification, right? Because if, let's say you're all in front of a building and it's like 12 people in front of a building, they have the right legally to say, you know what, I have the right to check to see that you live in this building. So even though it seems intrusive to a lot of people, I usually try to tell people to deal with this as you would any kind of a dangerous animal. If you're dealing with an animal that's like a little bit aggressive and it comes towards you, you don't really want to escalate the situation, right? Because whenever we have police encounters, the reality is that they have the power to physically grab you and to put you, for whatever time, they can put you in a cell or to give you a ticket, but they have that power to make that decision, to physically do whatever, whether you're right or you're wrong. And so what happens a lot of times is that people have a verbal disagreement with an officer. You might see an officer being a little bit aggressive with somebody and you're like, yo, why do you have to treat that person that way? And the officer's like, what? Do you want some of this too? Why are you talking to me? And then you get into a verbal back and forth with an officer. That can be seen as a sign of escalation. I mean, however you want to look at it, it can escalate the situation to the point where the officer can now say that you were reckless or you were, endangering their safety, you were obstructing governmental administration. They can say that you were disorderly, disorderly conduct. It's one of these things that officers are sort of allowed to use. So let's say you're just having a discussion with an officer. Hey, I didn't like the way you treated that young person. Why did you grab his bag? He didn't have a right to, to question or to consent. The officer could say, you know what, you're disorderly right now. You're interfering in an arrest. So again, I don't say this to say that we should all back down anytime an officer said something, right? We just have the right to ask questions without escalating the situation. So if let's say you're in front of a building, you haven't done anything wrong. The officer comes up to you and says, hey, I need to stop you because, somebody described a person fitting your description here. You have the right to say, officer, am I being stopped right now? Am I being arrested? Because sometimes officers will say, hey, can I see your ID? But you don't know if you're being stopped or not. And so you have the right to question, oh, officer, am I being stopped or not? That officer at that time has to tell you, oh, well, I know I'm just asking a question, or they have to tell you, yes, I'm stopping you because this person said you were blocking the entrance, or this person said whatever complaint they raised. But if an officer is simply asking you a question, or if they're just having a conversation, then you don't have to necessarily respond all the time. So an officer can say, have you seen anything over here in front of this building? If you later on decide, you know what, I'm not being questioned for this, right? You guys are investigating this as a crime. I don't consent to any questioning. Then that's absolutely fine. And the officer is supposed to leave you alone. They're not supposed to do anything to impede you. They're not allowed to physically stop you if all they're doing is simply an investigation, right? They're just simply asking questions. If they're actually investigating a crime where they have to stop you, then they need to indicate why they're stopping you. And in that case, you may have to provide ID, but you don't have to give them any information other than your address, your name, and your destination. So again, when we go back to just an initial encounter, right? Like maybe some young kids who are in front of a building, or maybe adults who were stopped in a park. A lot of times the parks are closed after a certain period in the day. And so I've had friends who have been stopped because they were just in the park, and they didn't get the notice that this park closes at 7 o'clock. And so the officers approach them and they're like, can I see some ID? And people are uncomfortable. They're like, oh, I didn't even realize I did anything wrong. So in those situations, if you're by yourself and you feel that this officer is sort of being a little bit aggressive, you should ask, why am I being stopped? Is there a reason why I'm being stopped right now? And you can also ask, officer, am I being stopped or am I free to go? Right? Because these things sort of clarify what's happening. If the officer says, I'm just asking a few questions, you know what? With all due respect, I don't have a problem with the police officer, with the police, but I don't consent to any further questioning. I try to say the word consent a lot if you're having an incident with the police. The reason why you use the term consent is because officers have to have your consent in order to question you or to search inside of your bag or inside of your private, things you have inside of your pocket or your pocketbook. In order to search anything private, they have to have your consent. And so without your consent, they have to have legal justification, meaning that if somebody says that you were shooting a gun, then they don't need to have your consent to search your bag, right? But if they just see you walking down the street and for some reason they have questions about how, what you're doing, they might stop you and say, hey, I need to look in your bag. When they say, may I look in your bag, they're actually asking you for the permission to search your bag, right? And a lot of people give them consent. People are like uncomfortable with how the police are. Sometimes police come up to you aggressively and they ask you a few questions first. And then they say, oh, do you mind, check it if I look inside of that bag, and the person kind of says, oh, no problem, and shows them, sometimes people will open their jackets to let them know they don't have anything on them. But what you're doing is you're basically giving an unjustified search to the officer. You're sort of giving up your rights to your privacy.
We have another question
Yes.
regarding consenting to search bags. What about the stops before entering the subway, like those kind of checkpoints that the police have set up for? Are you able to deny consent in those situations?
Okay, so those are different. My understanding is that those stops that happen in the subways happened as a result of the Patriot Act, and that happened after 9/11. And basically, they made a rule that in these certain stations that you have to have your bag searched if you're going to go into that train station. So if you decided that you don't want to get your bag searched, you can leave the station. You can walk to another station, you can take a bus, you can do other things. So in that sense, they don't have the absolute right to search every person. But if you decide that you want to use that station and they have a setup there, they have the right to stop everybody that's coming through. And I believe that's based on the Patriot Act and special rules that were made, around terrorism and things like that. Yeah, but other than that, no, the police don't have a right to search you unless they have specific incidents or information. So if somebody says, these young kids were on my block shooting a minute ago, and they had a red bag, then the cops have the right to search a person on that block who has a red bag. That's sort of specific information that they can use. But what they don't have the right to do is, all right, I see 10 kids on the corner, I'm gonna stop all of them and check their bags. Because what happened a lot of times in the last 10 years was that you had a high frequency of people being arrested for low-level marijuana crimes, right? They were like, in New York City, you had, I think, maybe 80 to 90% of misdemeanor crimes were low-level marijuana arrests. And a lot of the times it was these officers who had quotas. They knew they had quotas to bring in certain types of people. And so they would go out looking for young people who might have weed on them or have something illegal and would just basically have no reason to stop them. And if you don't know your rights, you don't have the power to say, officer, I don't consent to this. Why are you stopping me? Am I free to go? Am I being stopped? Then you're kind of uncomfortable. And so you're like, okay, I'm just gonna let them do what they do. And a lot of people got arrested for like having $5 or $10 worth of marijuana and ended up with, charges. Sometimes those charges ended up on their record and people end up not being able to go to school or continue teaching or whatever, things that people are involved in. So there's a cost to this level of enforcement, obviously. And so we want to make sure that if people are giving up their information, opening their bags or opening their privacy, that they're aware that they have the right to not do that,
There's another just kind of follow up on the inside the train, inside the subway station searching places. Joe is wondering, just to clarify, if they ask to search your bag, you can say no and leave and they won't see that as suspicious, like they won't.
Yes, right.
Okay.
You're allowed to say, with all due respect, I don't want to have my bag searched, and you're allowed to leave. There's no one's going to trace you or make a note of it or anything like that. So I haven't seen a whole lot of those stops in New York anymore, but honestly, I haven't been riding the trains since February, so I don't know.
Is there like an official list of where those kind of stations are? Or is it kind of just up to the cops to be like, we want to be in?
I don't know if there was a list. I know that I used to see them a lot at Nostrand Avenue in Crown Heights, and maybe in Fulton Street in Manhattan, but I don't know if there's a list or anything like that.
I've seen them at Bryant Park a lot, 42nd Street Bryant Park Station, and then Prospect Park.
Yeah.
There's also been some stations that I used to see regularly when I was also Forest Hill, Queens. Somebody added Union Square for sure.
Yeah.
Sounds like high population station. Times Square, often Franklin Ave, Brooklyn. Yeah, they're.
Yeah. So I mean, so a lot of these things are again related to, terrorism funding that came through in 9/11, but if you're in New York, you realize we have not had a lot of terrorist incidents, and you've had a few crazy people go off, but it's not like we have the need for all of this funding. And so, and a lot of it goes towards our communities. It goes towards watching people, and the immigration situation is obviously something that's been focused on. But so yeah, so with all this enforcement, we need to make sure that we know why we're being stopped and what's going on. And again, when you're in that first stage of the police encounter, really not good to escalate it. Like people, a lot of times the cops will come up and say, "Hey, can I see your ID?" And people are like, "Why you treat me like this? This is racist. You don't have any reason to do this." And people kind of like, we all have trauma in our history in the past, maybe, and so things come up when we're stressed out, and so you don't want to allow the police to use that, is what I'm saying, because they will sometimes try to get you a little excited. They'll try to get you a little bit uncomfortable in order to see if they can use this to arrest you or get a ticket, because these things actually are favorable for them. The more people that they arrest or give tickets to, a lot of times comes out in their favor, which is part of policing, the strategy of policing. But in your case, you don't really want to get into an argument with the officer about whether what they're doing is justified or racist or any of that. You really want to stick to the facts. And so, the cops come up and they're like, "Hey, how are you doing? Can I see your ID?" Officer, I don't have a problem with showing your ID, but I'm curious, am I being stopped? Am I being arrested? That's a good way to handle it, right? You're not really raising your voice. You're not really challenging them as a person. You can, you don't have to say, "I respect the police," but you can say, "I don't have a problem with the police officer, but I'm just questioning, am I being stopped now, or am I free to go?" These are just regular questions you can ask, and you're not taking it to the level where you're calling them, any bad names or, because one thing I do want to say is that, I try to be empathetic, and officers are under a lot of pressure. And so when they go out in the streets, a lot of people are looking at them like, "Oh, all you do is violate people and you're terrible and we hate you." And so whenever officers are approached, a lot of times they will get that response from people like, "You're treating me like you control me, and why are you doing," people overreact sometimes with police. And so we've got to also think that they're traumatized. They're dealing with this also. They're sometimes traumatized. And so, you just don't want to make it into a thing where like now it's me versus the police. You just want to make sure that they're aware that your rights and there are restrictions on what they're allowed to do. So in that instance, I wouldn't have a problem if I was in front of a building and the cop said, "Look, I want to check your ID." If you feel that there's a justification for what they're doing, meaning that you're in a large group, meaning that you're in a park after dark, maybe there's some sort of other violation, maybe you're parked in a bus stop or something like that. These are things that they have the right to ask for your ID. So you can say, "Look, officer, I don't mind showing you ID, but I don't consent to any further questioning," right? And maybe you want to wait until they further question you, but you just want to let them know, "I don't consent to anything further," just to let them know that you're aware. Again, consent is the legal responsibility that they have to get. They have to have your consent in order to search your car, your vehicle, or whatever.
We have a few more questions regarding that. What do officers do with your ID once they have it? Do they search for warrants or other things like that?
Okay, so my understanding is that they have a New York City information system of information where they keep your records if you have any, outstanding warrants and things like that. And they just kind of check it through their files. And, if there's any outstanding things, they'll let you know at that time. It's not always a arrest situation if you have a warrant. Sometimes people have gotten caught for something 10 years before and didn't go to court for whatever reason, didn't pay that warrant. Sometimes the officers will actually tell you, look, you know what, there's a warrant on your record, but you can go down to there's an office of warrants pretty much in every city, and they'll let you know what, you can go and take care of this on your own. Now, there are cases where, let's say they're having a disagreement with you, and then they run your ID and they find out you have a warrant, and it becomes, all right, now we're going to punish this person. So it's like, oh, didn't know that you had this suspended license from 5 years ago or whatever. And so they do have the power in those incidents to decide whether they're going to give you a ticket or whether they're going to run you through taking you to the precinct, or whether they're just going to give you a warning. And some of those are very much based on how you interact with that officer. You can be very polite with an officer. Oh, officer, I'm so sorry. I really didn't understand. I wasn't supposed to turn there. Maybe they changed the sign, and you can get off with a warning. You can be very aggressive with an officer. Why are you stopping me? What was your reason? And end up with a ticket. So, it's a lot of it is really just thinking these things through, but also thinking them in the sense of our rights. We don't want to allow them to continue this feeling of like we can go anywhere and treat people however.
So one other question: are officers required to provide an answer to "Am I being stopped?" or "Am I free to go?" And if they don't give an answer, what should someone do next?
Okay, so when you ask that question, officer, am I being stopped? They have to answer. They have to say, yes, I'm stopping you because this person said, that you did this, or I'm stopping you because I saw you do this. They have to give you a reason, or they have to say, no, I'm just questioning you. I'm just asking a few questions, right? If the answer is, I'm just questioning you, you have basically the right to go. And I would say that just try to do that with letting them know that, like, I don't have a problem with you, officer. There's really no issue here, but I don't consent to, having any further conversation at this time, or, I'm just going to go about my business, officer, and, I'm not part of this investigation, so I just want to leave. And they're not allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to stop you, to, physically do anything, right? Once they've indicated that you're free to go. Now, if they say you are being stopped, that's a different situation, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to be arrested, but it just means that they're trying to figure out how to handle whatever incident is going on. Maybe there's somebody hit somebody's car, maybe there's some sort of thing, and they're just trying to figure it out. And so for some period of time, they'll say, look, I need you to wait here, and we just need to talk to this woman over here and find out what happened, that kind of thing. And so those sorts of things happen in police investigations, but they do need to indicate whether you're free to go or not, and that's important. So the next question, and some of these things will come up in the next few stages. So after your initial police encounter, which is, again, initial police encounter or approach, common law right to inquire, is just the police coming up, asking you for your ID, asking maybe if you live in the building, that kind of thing. Or if you're in a park, checking to see if that the park is closed, those sorts of minor incidents. The second level of a police encounter is called explanatory information. These are all part of our workshop, if you're following along. But basically, it's described as explanatory information because now you have an officer who may approach you. In some instances, these officers are undercover, and they may ask, hey, do you have anything on you? Do you have a weapon? Do you have any drugs on you? This is something that, in honesty, I've seen a lot in African-American neighborhoods. I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. We have like NYCHA buildings that are very close. And so there are undercovers who ride around, and they just sort of, sometimes maybe they know the people who are involved in street activities or whatever, but they just kind of ride around and check everybody who's out at night. And sometimes they look at young people who are not involved in anything, who are just going out, because everybody lives in these communities. So it's not just that, there's gang activity. There are regular people who are going to college and doctors and all that. So they a lot of times will stop anybody who's out at night, and they may ask, where are you coming from? Do you have any weapons on you? That kind of thing. And so people get very uncomfortable in the situation. I've seen it happen where the cops are sitting in a car, they stop a young person, hey, you, come here. You know, it's literally like, hey, you come here. And when you're, I mean, even as an adult, you don't really know how to handle that. If I'm walking down the street and an officer is sitting in a car, whether he's wearing a uniform or not, and he says, hey, you come here, it's uncomfortable, right? It's an uncomfortable situation. And so I always tell people when they say that, when that incident happens, they say, hey, you come here. You always want to start off with asking that question, officer, excuse me, am I being stopped? Am I being arrested? Clarify that first before you decide to walk over, because what the officer is generally trying to do is they want to ask a bunch of questions. They want to find out who you are, where you are you involved in a gang? Are you doing this? Did you see anybody doing that? You know, they're looking for a lot of information that they can use to enforce ticketing and to make an arrest. So even if you're a regular person and you haven't done anything wrong, you can still be questioned. You can be aggressively, questioned like that. So when an officer says, hey, you come here, always want to ask that first. Am I being stopped? Yes or no? And if the officer says, do you have a gun or a knife on you? Just realize that you're at a different level of a police encounter. This is not the regular approach or common law right to inquire, because now they're trying to maybe connect you with criminal activity. They might be asking if you're in a gang, if you have, weapons or anything like that. So just be aware that this could become a more serious situation. And as civilian, it's a good idea to try to identify that officer. If you can even look at their badge number, if you can even get their license plate on their vehicle, just try to observe these things, because the reason why is because you don't know where this is going to go, right? I've had friends who are walking down the street. I'll give an example. I mean, this is not a sad example, but a friend of mine was literally going to pick up his daughter one day and was approached by 4 undercover officers. They were like, hey, you come here. Same kind of thing. He's like, officer, I know my rights. I'm going to, if you don't have a reason to stop me, I'm just going to pick up my daughter. These cops didn't like the way that he responded to them, but they were like, I guess aggressive or whatever. They hopped out of the car and they ended up grabbing him because he didn't stop. And they ended up dragging him. They pulled, my friend has dreadlocks. They pulled 4 dreadlocks out of his head during this arrest, and literally had no reason for any of this. They ended up taking him to the precinct. And after an hour at the precinct, they realized they had no reason to charge him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had no criminal record. There was no reason. So they literally just tried to let him go. You're free. You're good to go, And we, my organization, which I was part of, actually sponsored a lawsuit on his behalf. He ended up getting paid. The city ended up paying him about $60,000 for this incident. But these are the kind of things that happen all the time. He's just literally going to pick up his daughter, and was dragged and stopped for no reason. And it was because, the cops were like, hey, you come here. And he didn't, stop. So we got to know that when these things happen, make sure that you're clear on what's happening. Don't like it's one thing to say, you know what, they don't have any reason to stop me, so I'm just going to keep walking. But make sure you make that clear to them. Make sure that you're aware, like, look, officer, I'm aware of my rights. I'm not being stopped, so I'm going to keep continuing to go about my business, and make it clear. And sometimes if there are witnesses around, you even want to make that verbally in a way that everybody can, support you if there's ever a legal case. So if you're being stopped and you're uncomfortable and there are people around watching, officer, I'm not resisting you and I don't give you consent to search me. Why, you can say those things so that there are other people around. And if it ever becomes a case, you can have some support. People can write a witness statement or something like that. But just understand, the second level is considered explanatory information because it's a higher level of police intrusion into your life where they're now asking, do you have a weapon or guns or anything like that? Okay, so the third level of police encounter is considered stop or detainment, right? This is the phase of police encounter where a police officer has actually indicated to you in some way or another that you're not free to go. sometimes you don't know when that's the case, right? There might be something crazy happening and you don't know what's going on if you're free to go or not. And the cop is like, hey, you, stop there, right? So usually it's a verbal indication. Sometimes it's officers with guns out, but usually it's the officers telling you, hey, I need you to wait here for some time, or I need you to stand over there, right? That indicates that you've been stopped. If you're not clear, ask, officer, am I free to go? I don't know what's going on here. Am I free to go? Am I being arrested? When they say, no, you're not being arrested, but I need you to wait here, or I just need you to stop and hang out, then you're stopped, basically. And that basically means that for some period of time, they're just going to figure out what's happening and decide if they're going to charge anybody or not. When you're stopped, they may ask you questions, right? They may ask you for your ID. They may actually do what's called a pat down. A pat down is not supposed to be a full frisk. And I just want to be sort of clear on this. When officers stop you, they're allowed to do what's called a pat down, right? Which is on the outside of your clothing. So it's basically to make sure that they're not at risk of being injured. So they're basically checking your outside clothing. They're checking your pockets, your back pockets, to see if there's any weapon. Now, if anybody has ever seen this, sometimes the cops will actually ask, where they'll say, do you have anything in your pockets that's going to endanger me? Or they'll sometimes verbally say that to the person, and the person says, yeah, I have a pocket knife, or I've got this or that. But basically what they're doing is they're doing a weapons check for safety. What they're not supposed to do, even if it's a stop, is to do a full frisk, meaning that now that they're going into your interior pockets, they're not supposed to be going inside of your wallet, to check all your personal information, your credit cards. They're not supposed to be going through, like anything that you have that's internal. It's really just for weapons. And at that point, they should have a female officer there. If let's say you're a woman being stopped and a male officer comes over and wants to pat down, you should always ask that a female officer is there. Like, I don't want to have a male officer pat me down. But my understanding is that legally they don't have to require a female officer, because they can say that it was a dangerous situation and we just had to, find out whatever's going on. And so we didn't have the time to wait for a female officer. I still suggest that you should make it very clear that, look, I don't want a male officer touching me or any of that. And so please request a male officer if you're going to do anything like that. That way, at least you're making it clear, right? Because officers sometimes violate based on how they feel. So things that you can do to get stopped. I just want to go back to that. This is sort of in the package also, but if an officer sees you maybe moving a large expensive item like a 55-inch TV at 4 a.m, these are things that maybe are subjective, but they can kind of use to cause a stop, right? If an officer sees you, or rather you see an officer and you automatically take off running, it seems like, well, maybe I have the right to run, maybe it's not a problem, but it gives the officer justification to stop somebody if they see you and you automatically respond by taking off or running. If they see you and you try to hide something in your jacket, then that also gives them the justification to stop you, because the whole idea is that they're now witnessing something that could potentially be a crime. So it gives them a little bit of flexibility with how they can stop you. Other things are if you're wearing things that look like gang paraphernalia, right? Like if you're wearing red or blue, they're not allowed to stop you for that, right? Even though we see it happen all the time where they're stopping people because they're like, oh, he looks like he's in a gang. They're technically not allowed to stop you based on your physical appearance, right? So if you're wearing a baggy baggy jeans or you're wearing a hoodie or any of that kind of stuff that they might interpret as, oh, this person looks like a criminal, that's actually called profiling when they stop you. And let me go back real quick. We didn't talk about this before, but the idea behind profiling is that a person doesn't really have information about what they're looking for, right? So they're looking for, let's say they're looking for criminals who are stealing cars, or they're looking for burglars. They're looking for whatever category of crime they're looking for, right? But they don't really have information on who these people are. So when you don't have information, you create a profile in your head. A profile is information which might lead you to that person. So the profile maybe is what that person looks like, their age, their ethnicity, their appearance. You know, there are a number of things that people use to create a profile, but basically profiling has been listed as illegal. It's illegal to racially profile people under the laws of the city of New York and in most places, because profiling is basically creating a status of somebody. You know, you're creating maybe I'm not describing this right, but you're creating a perception of an individual when you actually don't have information of what that individual is doing. So what we really need to be doing as far as actual policing is finding out the information, you know, finding out who's really involved in committing these crimes. Profiling is when you look at somebody who's wearing a red bandana and you assume this person's in a gang. So I'm going to stop anybody who's wearing a red bandana. Or, you know what, a lot of people have been wearing this color jacket, so I'm going to assume that all those people are criminal. That is basically profiling, and it's what's wrong. It's basically what stopped a lot of people from receiving justice, is because of like the fact that they think of people that way. So again, when you're in a stop, you know, they're not allowed to use that for profiling. What they are allowed to do is specific information. So if somebody calls in and says a guy was wearing black shirt and blue jeans and tried to break into my house, they can use that as a description for you. They can say, we stopped you because you fit the description, right? And people have problems with that too, because they use that as a very common way of saying, well, we stopped you because you fit the description. And people have actually challenged them. You can call back to the dispatcher and find out whether there was a description giving out that matched your stop. So in some cases, people have actually done that. They've said, look, I want to call back to the dispatcher and see if my description was given out, right? And you might even be able to start a lawsuit based on that. But basically, yeah, they have the right to say you fit the description, but they don't have the right to fully profile you just based on, you know, their subjective impressions. But the reality is that it does happen, right? Illegally, it's not supposed to happen, but it does happen. They often look at people and just decide to stop this person because of how they looked, because of the way they appeared, and how they were on the street. So when you are stopped, the only information you have to give is your name, your address, and your destination. You don't have to say what happened. You don't have to describe the incident. Generally, when people are stopped is when they try to talk their way out of a situation, right? And so you get stopped because maybe there was a dispute on the street. An example I always give is like, you know, you're walking with your cousin, you turn a corner and they run into somebody that doesn't like you, and shoving happens, you know, there's a fight or something like that. So the cops get called, and now basically they separate the two people into two different groups, right? One officer is questioning you and your friend. Another officer is questioning those people. And usually what happens is the cops are just looking to make an arrest, right? They want to arrest somebody because there was some kind of a physical assault. And if they can arrest two people, they'll arrest two people. If they can arrest five people, they'll arrest five people. But people try to explain what happened or why they were justified in doing what they did. And so you might say something like, look, we've known these people forever. They've always been messing with my cousin, and we were just, you know, protecting her. You know, we were just, you know, protecting her rights, basically. Even by saying that, even by saying, you know what, we were defending her, you're sort of admitting that there was a physical occurrence. And if the police decide that they want to take you in for that, they can. Now, again, maybe policing is starting to change now, but we've had a situation for the last 10, 15 years where cops were basically being motivated to bring people in for almost everything. You know, if you can prove that this person dropped a piece of paper on the street, you know, you can arrest them. And so if you, even in trying to get out of a stop, right? Let's say another example of a stop, maybe for younger people, you know, people go to stores all the time, and let's say out of 10 people that go to the store, somebody decides to steal some candy. The cops may decide to stop everybody outside of that store, right? And they're like, oh, you guys want a group. You might decide to say, you know what, officer, we didn't know that that guy was going to steal. He's with us, but we didn't know that he was going to do that. You know, that happens a lot. And maybe you're in a group and a fight happens or something like that. You know what, we didn't know they were going to do that. You're still affirming to the police that a fight happened, that you were there, that this person was your friend, you know, and so if they want to make the case that you were an accomplice to a crime, they can, right? So what I'm saying is don't give them that option. Just let them know, look, officer, I'm going to give you my name, my address, but I don't consent to any further questioning at this time. If you're with a person who's under the age of 16, you can tell them, look, you know, I'm not legally required to give a statement until I have a guardian here, right? So definitely if you have younger folks, let them know that they have the right not to consent until they have a guardian there. Because a lot of times police are stopping young people. They recognize these young people are maybe less aware of their rights. And so they're like, you know what, let me check this guy and see if he knows this or if he can identify who did this or whatever. So you have to be the one to let them know, look, I need to have my guardian here if you're going to question me. But basically, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble by offering even what you consider to be the right things. You know, like this person attacked me for no reason. All I did was defend myself. Even that alone can be a problem. So, you know, use your judgment. I would always say use your judgment in those situations because, you know, like, again, I'll give you an example. I was in a car and made a wrong turn. And so the cop already has witnessed me make a wrong turn. So I don't have the power to be like, oh, I can't give you this information or that information. And if they ask me for a justification, maybe I can say, look, you know what, I made that turn because I didn't realize you changed the law or whatever. So maybe I'm in a way admitting, but he's already got me because he already saw me. So what I'm saying is you have to be smart about how you're gonna, if you're gonna admit that something happened, make sure that it's gonna be to your benefit. You know, make sure that you're not admitting to, like, you know, sometimes when the cops say, like, how many beers have you had tonight? And people are like, oh man, I just had a few. You know, you're getting yourself in trouble sometimes by doing that. Sometimes you just want to say, officer, I didn't have anything, or you just want to say, I'm not answering that question or whatever. You know, you don't want to admit to like doing things wrong. And in a stop is when people tend to do that because people are under pressure. They're like, I don't know if I'm going home. This cop's got me here. And so I'm just going to tell him everything. You know what? This guy was drinking in the car. I don't know why he was doing that. And then this guy did this. And, you know, it's not, you don't want to have all those legal issues come out in front of an officer, is all I'm saying. Because the cops really, their only job is to determine if you're to be arrested or not. And so those things can come out later.
We have a couple questions, if that's okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So regarding asking for a female officer for a pat down, can only women request female officers pat them down?
No, I think anybody can request that. Again, at least during the stage of a detainment or a stop, they're not required to provide you with a female officer. But I'm just saying that our understanding as far as legal observers and people we've been in the past, we've just asked people to raise that because the problem is, honestly, that there are situations, you know, we've been talking about the protests that have been happening where people do get arrested during a protest. And sometimes these cops are very angry because they're like, I finally got one of them, you know? And so when they do a frisk on a woman, they're very aggressive, you know? And so you would just want to make sure that you put that out there. Like, look, I don't want anybody touching me who's not, you know, whatever. And if they decide to do it, that's, you know, that's their power, and we may have a way of challenging it later. But you just want to make sure you don't give them consent.
If an officer says you fit the description and they ask your permission to have another citizen ID you, what should you do?
If an officer says you fit the description, then generally that means that they're going to arrest you, or they're going to ticket you in some way. So there's not much you can do in that case. I mean, basically, if a person has charged you with a crime, it's going to go through the court system. You're going to, at some point, see a judge, and the validity of those claims is going to be determined by the lawyers in court. You know, the prosecutor will sit with the defense attorney, and they will analyze whatever case is in front of you. And then they will make a recommendation to the judge as to whether you should be charged or not, you know. And so those things are going to come out in the court process.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so you don't have to think that they're all going to be worked out, and, you know, initially. Yeah.
And then the last one that I have right now is how can an observer help someone being wrongfully stopped, avoid having their rights violated, arrested, etc.?
Okay, so if you're an observer and you want to stop someone who's being violated, there are several things we can do, right? In an organized way, there are organizations like Cop Watch, right? There are people who have been trained on how to observe and to go to protests and to activist events. And I've been part of Cop Watch for years. Like, people literally still call me. They're like, yo, can you Cop Watch? And I'll just show up, you know, if I'm available. And basically what we do is we sort of surround the outside of a march. There are generally people who are at the back of a march, at the front, and walking down the sides. And if you see something happening, your job is to respect the physical distance, because what happens is police create a perimeter. Anytime there's an incident, they sort of create like maybe an ellipse or some kind of a perimeter. And you're not really supposed to go inside of that, because they can charge you with obstructing governmental administration. They can charge you with resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, even if you're not doing those things, right? You could just literally be like, hey, what are you doing? You know, and they can grab you. I have friends in the last few weeks who've been grabbed like that, because like at Barclays, they were just beating people up. And my friend is literally trying to pull the cops away from somebody who's beating them up and gets arrested. So all those things happen. But in general, yeah, the police are not, they're not just allowed to do everything, you know. I'm sorry, what was that question?
Oh, okay. The question was, how can an observer help someone being wrongfully stopped?
Okay, so one of the things you can do is, when you see this person getting grabbed by the police, try to videotape it, first of all, from a respectable distance. That's the strongest evidence you can have, is video, right? Anything saying, well, I saw the officer do this, and, you know, is going to come up with the officer gives his account and your account. And you might win, but it's not always the case, right? If you have physical evidence of what happens, that's the best thing to do. The other thing to do is to get that person's name, find out, if you can, their phone number. Like, I've noticed a lot of legal observers doing this. They're like, say your name, you know, and give your address. So that way they can, if they have any video of this, they can post it. They can let people in the community know that this happened to you, because that can protect your rights as well. You know, just the fact that people know where you are, that what court you're at. Because if you get arrested and people don't know where you are, they have more pressure. There's nobody who can advocate for your rights. Maybe you don't have a lawyer to come down. So there's a lot of ways we can protect each other, but I would say in general, definitely getting their private information if you can, and trying to videotape and follow up. You know, like, if you have their information, you know they're getting arrested, find out what court they're at, find out how you can support bail funds. You know, that's another thing that for people who are not out in the streets of these protests, you know, realize that there are a lot of people who are dealing with this still, people who were arrested, and that's one of the ways you can also support, is just putting money towards some of the bail fund organizations. And I think people are aware, but I know some people here maybe are from different communities. The reason why bail funds has become such a big issue has to do with the prison industrial complex, right? Because so many people in Rikers and in jails in general, I mean, America has the highest percentage of prisons, the prison population. We've got like, I think it's like a quarter of the world's prison population. And a lot of that prison population are people who've just been charged, but don't have the money to bail themselves out, right? So you could get charged with anything. And, I had a case where, I'll give you a perfect example. One guy was an artist who I taught at Rikers for a year. He was an artist, and he literally got picked up because he dropped off his sister's boyfriend at a building, and the guy ended up getting into an altercation and killing someone at that building. But he was not involved. He literally just dropped this guy off and ended up spending about a year in jail fighting those charges because of bail, right? So, and this guy never hurt anyone, was like literally all he's doing is designing fashion and merchandise. So there's so many people in that situation, and it's basically one of those things where like people have identified bail funds as a way of creating justice, because there's so many people that have these cases that people have literally started in Brooklyn and the Bronx. I think there's one in Manhattan, but almost in every borough, there's some kind of bail fund organization, which is a nonprofit thing, and you can literally just pay for people to get out of jail. What they're supposed to do is they're supposed to review the cases, so they're not letting out anybody who's violent, anybody who's domestically abusive, anybody who's going to cause a problem. But people who are unjustly incarcerated, they have a responsibility to try to get some of those people out. So you can definitely, those are ways we can support folks as well. And also becoming involved, if you want to get involved in Cop Watch or any things like that, there are organizations where people are doing stuff like that on a grassroots level. So let me just finish with we were talking about the stop and frisk, and basically, the fact that they're going to stop you, but you really should not try to give up all your information. And they do have the power, we talked about the power that they have to just kind of go through your outside, but not the inside. Now, when you get to the fourth stage of a police encounter, this is obviously the most serious. This is when you're actually arrested. So when you're arrested, what that means is that you're going to be, in general, you will be charged with some kind of crime. You may not know right at the time you're arrested what you're being charged with, right? So you often see people like at the arrest, like, what am I being charged with? What are you arresting me for? You don't really, again, want to escalate the arrest by saying, what are you charging me for? They're going to charge you with something if they're going to arrest you. So you don't want to become physically like, oh, you don't have the power to arrest me unless you tell me what it's for. I've seen that happen a lot of times where people are like challenging the arrest, and so they become, either physically or whatever against what the police are trying to do. And, the reality is you're putting yourself at risk. Like, the police have the power to pull out a gun, they have batons, and you don't want to play that game with them. So it's better to either allow what's going to happen. If they decide that they're going to arrest you, just allow it to happen and fight it later, because a lot of times they didn't have the justification to do it anyway. I was in a situation where I was arrested during Cop Watch. We literally were just observing them arresting two guys, and they had been physically abusive. And a cop comes over, arrests me and three of my, people that were doing Cop Watch. We ended up going to court and suing them and getting almost $15,000 because they had no right to arrest us. So it's much better to not fight in that situation on the street. Just let it happen later on. So when you are arrested, you're going to be charged with something at some point. When you're arrested first, they're going to take you to the precinct. They're going to do a full search. A full search is different than a stop and frisk that happened before, where they're just patting you outside of your clothing. They're going to literally check everything. They're going to check all your personal information. They're going to go through all your wallet, down to the finest details. They will ask you to remove your belt. I don't know if they do like for guys, if they make you take down your underpants and that kind of thing, but they do a full search to make sure that you don't have any weapons and all that kind of stuff. So, and at that point, they do have to have a woman there. So when it's an arrest, you have the power to say, look, I do not want a male officer, and they actually are legally required. It's been written in their police handbooks and all that kind of thing. Also, when you're arrested, you don't want to try to talk it out with the officers. A lot of times people are in a holding cell and the cops come in and they're like, what's this about? You know, what were you doing? In my case, when I was arrested during Cop Watch, they came in about 3 times and they were like, what's going on, guys? Were you playing games? You know, another time they were like, were you guys making a movie? You know, and they just try to ask, they try to just find out what's going on. It's really better not to talk. I literally didn't say anything to them. And it's not like it's going to help you. They're not going to find out something and just let you out once they have you arrested. So you're not doing yourself a favor by talking. And also, if there are other people in the cell, you don't really want to have too much conversation with them, because sometimes those people are either connected or they have other ways of misrepresenting your information, and it can just put you at more jeopardy. So when you get arrested, again, you just want to let them know, look, I am not going to make any statements until I have a lawyer present, you know, unless I have a legal guardian. Now, they do have to make the Miranda warning, which I should just speak about. The Miranda warning basically says that, you know, you have the right to not answer questions. You know, the 3 things that they say: you have the right not to consent unless you have a lawyer present. And those things basically protect you from snitching on yourself. So that means basically if you get arrested and you offer information or you confess to a crime, the officers are supposed to let you know beforehand that you don't have to answer questions. You have the right to have a lawyer. And if you're under 16, you know, you have the right to a guardian. They have to let you know those things because later on, let's say if you admit to a crime, right? The officers, you basically can challenge that in court and say, these officers didn't tell me that I was, you know, risking my rights by offering this information. And so the Miranda warning is actually supposed to protect you if you confess to a crime without getting that warning from the officers, right? Now, in some cases, people might confess to a crime with, you know, while the officers made that warning or whatever. Later on, if your lawyer wants to challenge that, it's up to the lawyer to say, look, you know, my client made a statement, but he was not aware, you know, that he had the right to be silent or whatever. Those things will come out in court. But basically, you have the right to not answer those questions when you get arrested, right? And not incriminate yourself. So people become a little bit unclear about that, and they think that because the officer, because there was a Miranda warning, maybe they're going to get out, you know. And what happens is if you confess to a crime, like let's say you get arrested for having a weapon, and later on you confess during the arrest, you know, yeah, I had this weapon because, you know, I was having problems with this person or whatever, and I decided to carry a weapon. Just because the officers didn't read you a Miranda warning and you made that confession doesn't mean that you're going to get out of jail. People think, oh, they didn't read me the Miranda warning, so I'm going to get out. You know, that's not the case. What it means is that maybe your confession is going to be invalid, but the physical evidence that the police officers might find is still going to be valid. Your arrest may still be valid, right? It just means that whatever confession you gave could be invalidated by the officers not warning you. Okay, sorry, I feel like I'm not explaining that fully clearly, but that's basically, it's for you, it's to protect your rights. But in general, when you do get arrested, you know, just give your name, your address, and your destination. Don't try to offer any extra information, because what's going to happen is you're going to see a public defender if you don't have your own lawyer. And the way that this works is that your public defender will generally sit down with your prosecutor in the morning, and they sort of work out how these cases are going to be resolved. So they'll either say, you're going to be released today and have a conditional discharge. A lot of times you'll get what's called an ACD if you've committed any small crime, or they consider you guilty of any small crime. You'll get an ACD, right? Which means you'll get to go home, but for 6 months, this charge could stay on your record because we're basically adjourning this in contemplation of dismissal. So you're sort of pleading guilty, but you're going to be fine if you stay out of trouble for 6 months. That is not a good situation for everybody, right? A lot of people get offered an ACD on their first arrest, right? You get any kind of thing, like, you know, people get arrested for marijuana or for selling water on the street, any kind of like small misdemeanor arrest, they give you an ACD a lot of times. But the problem with that is that you could be putting yourself in legal jeopardy because you might be wanting to go to school or to university. Certain types of occupations, you can't have any kind of conviction on your record, right? And so if you plead guilty to an ACD, even if it's something small and you know you didn't do it, you know, you could end up with that later on in your record. And so it's actually happened in a few cases where people, you know, Patrick Dorismond is somebody who was killed by an NYPD officer. And later on, there were questions about the murder because they were like, why was this guy killed? You know, he was basically not offering drugs to an officer and ended up getting shot. So later on, the city went back and introduced his juvenile record, which had all of his previously sealed convictions, and said, oh, this guy wasn't a great guy. You know, he had all this stuff going on in his youth. So that lets you know that even if you take an ACD, which is supposed to be a sealed verdict, it's not really sealed. It could come back again. So you should always plead not guilty. If you know that whatever you were arrested for, you're not guilty, you should try to plead not guilty. And if your lawyer disagrees, you can say, look, I just need you to make a plea of not guilty, and I'll come back with another lawyer. You can request a different lawyer, or you can hire someone, but you don't really want to take the route of just always pleading guilty. The reason I say this is because 90% of the cases that go to court are guilty pleas. You know, the reason again is because people don't have the resources to fight against a court case. And so if it's you versus a few cops and they've got more resources to say that you did this while you were driving and you did this and that, and you don't have any witnesses, a lot of times you might not win that case. And so people a lot of times will just decide, you know what, it's a lot easier for me to sign this release now. I get to go home and I'm sort of free of it for the moment, as opposed to me going to court and then I'm going to have to come back 3 or 4 times. I'm going to have to bring evidence. I might have to spend some money. All those sorts of things are important. And so people a lot of times will just decide, you know what, I'm just going to take this plea. But there are consequences. And so I just always tell people to consider whatever the reality is. Because there are some people who, if they go to court and get convicted, it could end up in them losing their freedom, you know? And so maybe it's a good idea to take a plea in certain situations, but just always be aware that you are putting yourself at some kind of consequence when you do that, you know? And, you know, there are free legal organizations that can help you. So if you have questions about your arrest or you think you should plead guilty, not guilty, you can call Legal Aid New York City. They're one of the free legal organizations. There's New York Civil Liberties Union is another organization who's been kind of in coalition with us. And the Bronx Defenders is one in Uptown. I think the New York City Defenders in Manhattan, but generally in every borough of New York City and probably around the country, there are free legal organizations who you can ask for help if you have any of those cases. So try to use those people because they're there, and a lot of times they're interested in changing the criminal justice situation we have now and providing greater accountability. So they're willing to help. They're willing to document if you feel something's been going wrong. So yeah, those things are important. And I want to say one of the last things I'll say as far as arrest is, so when you're arrested, you're going to go through, probably about 24 hours of time where you might be, waiting to get out. Then you'll see a judge. In some cases, people get arrested and don't see a judge, right? The cops decide for some reason that maybe 5 or 6 hours later, we're just going to send this person home from the precinct. Like my friend, the one I said who got stopped and the cops pulled him and ripped dreads out of his head, he was released in what's considered an undocketed arrest, right? They call it undocketed because it didn't go to the judge. There's no docket number. The cops literally just decided, you know what, we don't have any reason to charge this person. In those cases, you should always think about filing your own complaint or a lawsuit against the police, right? Because a lot of times what they do is considered malicious prosecution. The police might have an argument with somebody, they have a disagreement with somebody, and they get physical. That person then gets taken to jail. The cops realize they can't arrest this person, so they let them go. That's considered malicious prosecution because now they've basically taken your freedom when they didn't have a right to really arrest you. And you can hold them accountable for that. You can say, look, I was stopped by these officers. We had a verbal dispute and they arrested me for 4 hours. I was traumatized. I was, whatever the cases are. There are several ways you can do that, right? You can file a civilian complaint. In New York City, there's the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which is a nonprofit. It actually has people that sit on a board who have experience dealing with policing issues. And they make recommendations based on whatever the incident is. So let's say you say that this cop was physically abusive to you. What they're going to do is they're going to interview that officer. They're going to interview the witnesses. They're going to interview the person who was stopped and basically make a recommendation to the department or to the controlling officer that, you know what, this officer was abusive. He needs to be transferred or disciplined. And that controlling officer for the precinct, whoever commands that precinct, actually doesn't have the power to fire the officer, right? So sometimes they can transfer them. Sometimes they make no changes. So for that reason, some people consider the CCRB as not as effective because they're like, this thing doesn't really matter. The cops can decide whether or not they're going to make changes. But if you file a bunch of CCRB complaints, an officer receives like 5 or 6 in a year, chances are things will happen. And you can also legally, you can subpoena those cases that you filed with the subpoena, that you filed with CCRB. You can subpoena those for other legal cases. So let's say you have your own lawsuit against the NYPD, which a lot of people do. It's considered, you have to file what's called a notice of claim if you want to sue NYPD. And so basically, if you have something that happens within 90 days of that incident, you have the right to say, look, I'm going to start my own lawsuit against these officers for their behavior. And you can also use that legal, whatever CCRB investigated, you can use that as part of your case. So these are things that people should know because a lot of times we have issues behind how we were arrested and we don't have any way of responding, and so people get arrested in an undocketed arrest and they're just like, phew, I'm glad I was able to go home. And so they don't think about following up. But always know that you have the right to file a notice of claim. You have a right to file a civilian complaint review board, and also know that there are supportive organizations out there who will help you with those things. I used to sit down with people and literally just help them file their notices of claim free of charge because I thought it was an important issue that people were having these experiences and not feeling like they had the resources to deal with it. And, as we go forward thinking, how we can help support accountability, find good organizations who are doing this work and think of ways we can support them, in this time when we're looking for places to help build the kind of communities we want to create. A couple other things with the arrest situation. I'm going to need to plug my computer in a second, so I'm just gonna let you know I'm gonna have to make a run and plug this thing in. But when you are arrested, the police generally don't have the right to come into your house, right? So there's a section in our curriculum that talks about, you know, if the police come up to your house and they bang on the door and they're like, we're looking for this person, they have to have a warrant in order to find that person. And they have to indicate to you either under the door that that warrant is properly executed, that it has the date, the proper address and all that kind of thing, before you let them in. If you open your door because the police are looking for somebody and they put their foot in the door or they come inside, you have basically given them consent to come in your house, right? And so when you give them consent, they have the right now to look at anything that's inside the house, and they have a law that's basically says that anything they find, they can consider illegal. So a lot of times what they'll do is they're looking for maybe a member of the family who has had a past criminal history, and they show up very early in the morning and they're like, we're looking for Tyrone, or whoever it is, right? And people are like, oh, he's not here. And they're like, do you mind if we check? And people are like, all right, it's the cops. I'm a little nervous. Let me let them check. So they open the door. Now the cops can come in and they have what's called a plain sight law. So anything they see in the apartment, if it's illegal, a videotape, if they see marijuana paraphernalia, they can now threaten to have the entire building removed or evicted. You know, sometimes in NYCHA buildings that happens. So you really don't want to let the police in your house unless they have a justification, right? You want to make sure that there's some kind of physical warrant that they have, that they can actually, you know, come in your house, and that it's properly done. The only other time that they can come in your house is if they're chasing somebody, right? So if somebody is fleeing from the police and they run into your house, then they have the right to come in. There's also a case where if they think that evidence is going to be destroyed, they're allowed to come in. But I'm not sure exactly how that works, because I think that involves drug cases. And usually they have some kind of a, you know, a warrant when it comes to drug cases. So I'm not sure how they could break down your door if they think you're going to flush, you know, something down the toilet. But technically there's a reason how they can come in your house for those situations. Other than that, they're not allowed to come in your house. So you should always, you know, ask them, oh, do you have the, you know, a warrant to show that you have the right to be there.
Does that include, like, is that for private property, like a porch or someone's lawn, or is it just inside the door to your home?
Okay, I'm not absolutely clear if it's the outside porch of your house, but I know the inside of your house is considered private. So they have the right to, you have the right to stop them there. I don't know if you can stop them before they get to the porch, but yeah, that's a question I'd have to ask the lawyer. So, and then the other thing is with vehicles, right? When you're in a car, police have the right to ask you questions, to stop you if they see you doing something wrong, but they don't have the right to search your car all the time. So people a lot of times will give consent to police to search their car because they've been stopped, and maybe they made a bad turn. You know, the cops will stop you and be like, oh, you know, you turned left when you shouldn't turn right. Do you mind if I check the vehicle? Or maybe they just start questioning you, you know, how have you been tonight? What's going on? Did you guys have any drinks tonight? You know, people, no, we just, you know, came from a bar. My friend had one, I just had one. Do you mind if I check the vehicle? People feel like, well, I don't know if I have the right to say yes or no. So they're like, I don't mind. And so they oftentimes consent to the officers searching their car. The only time an officer has the absolute right is when they witness something in your car, like alcohol bottles. If you have empty bottles in your car, or if they can smell something that smells like marijuana, then they have the power to say, look, I need you to step outside of the car so I can check. If they don't see that, then you're basically giving them the right to search your car, which I don't suggest you do. Because we've even seen incidents where they've planted illegal stuff in people's cars. So you don't want to really allow them, you know, you can tell them, look, officer, if you're going to give me a ticket for the bad turn, I understand, but I don't consent to having my vehicle searched. And it's the same as you have when you're walking down the street. If a cop says, I want to search your bag, you have the right to say, I don't consent to this search. If they decide to do it, then they are violating, and you have the right to hold them accountable. You can file a CCRB, you can file your own lawsuit, but you at least want to let them know, look, I don't consent to this happening, and make it clear early on. And the same thing with the trunk in your car. The cops are not allowed to search the trunk unless you literally give them the right to search the trunk. So just be considerate of those things. So that's the 4 stages of police encounters. And I just want to take a break and ask if anybody has any questions, we can continue with that. I'm going to actually run and just charge my computer because it's going to run out. But maybe, I don't know if somebody wants to maybe take over for a second.
Okay. We actually have set aside about 2 hours for today's session, and so we're rapidly approaching our end time. We do have the capacity to continue. If folks would like to stay on, maybe let us know in the chat if we should answer another couple questions, or if we should find a way to continue this conversation in another way. Let us know in the chat how you want to proceed, those of you who are still with us.
Okay.
So we do have a question in the chat. What are your thoughts on defunding the police?
Well, I think that when you look at the amount of money that we spend on policing, it's kind of alarming. I mean, it's a national issue because I think it speaks to the militarism that you have. Like America spends so much money on militarism, and when you compare it to developing youth and compare it to the money we spend on things that we need, it just doesn't make any sense. My feeling is that we do need to have some kind of policing, right? I think that on a certain level, there are situations where you need to have accountable people in our community who are able to stop, when there's domestic violence, when there's dangerous situations and gangs taking over and all that kind of thing, But I feel that most policing now does not serve that purpose. I'll give you the perfect example. I live on a block where there were 2 shootings in a week, right? The police didn't do anything to stop that. The police basically can show up, they can place a lot of cones around where the bullets are, they can make arrests, but doesn't stop the problems. The people who, I look at it like a larger discussion. The problems that you have in communities, a lot of times are very small populations of the communities, right? It's like 5% of a community that's involved in crime or involved in, persistent levels of crime. But the whole community gets treated as if they're involved in that level of crime. And that was the same thing for stop and frisk. When you actually found the people who were stopped and frisked that were guilty of crimes, it was like literally 5%, less than 5% of those people that were stopped were actually guilty of anything. And so that's the case that you have here, where, you just have such an over-policing, which a lot of times is based on financial reasons. There's money given from state governments, from, everywhere to fund these organizations. And ultimately, are they helpful is the question that we need to be asking. Are these police generally helping our society feel safer? And most of the time it's not. I mean, at least in the community I live, when somebody decides that they're going to be violent and deal with a domestic situation, when somebody has a problem with their family or their neighbors, there are times when the police can get involved. I've definitely seen domestic situations where the police can get involved, but they don't solve the problem. They may stop it for that day. There's necessary interaction which has to happen to ultimately resolve those problems, right? Like, let's say, you know, the cops come to a domestic violence arrest, they can stop the guy maybe from um, assaulting his partner, but they don't necessarily have the support to offer her services. If she lives in a home with this person, you know, there needs to be services dedicated towards getting that person other solutions. Maybe there's mental counseling, maybe there's you know, all kinds of counseling that's needed to help people in these situations. And the police are not the answer in most of those situations. So I don't think that the defunding the police thing is an angry response. You know, like some people are like, oh, they're just so angry at the police that they just want to defund everything. It's just that it's not working. You know, the reality is that we have so many other issues in our society, and the police respond when they see people acting out. You know, when they see young people on the street who are homeless, when they see people who don't have money, people who are dealing with mental issues, their answer is policing. We got to get this person in a cell. We have to ticket them and, you know, create more, you know, reasons for them to pay us. Because ultimately, when you get arrested, you're paying lawyers. Your parents are paying lawyers. Money is involved. Bottom line, every time people are arrested, money is involved, and so we have to find a way to take that money out of the policing and find ways to get people help. You know, if we need to put more money towards mental health counseling so that it matches up with policing, then we need to do that. You know, we need to put more money towards schooling. Like, why do schools not? Why are teachers only paid $30,000 and cops are paid who knows how much? You know, like it's a basic thing that we're just not advocating the resources towards healing people. And I often feel that the police are asked to do an unreasonable job. You know, like I do believe that. I definitely believe that they're asked to respond to situations where it's like, what can I do other than violently respond, you know? And so you don't need the police in a lot of those situations. And so that, I think that when they talk about defunding the police, that's what they're talking about, is just reimagining everything, you know, reimagining how are we supposed to live, you know, because, you know, you have countries like Norway, right? They literally have not had a police murder in their society, I think in 10 years or something like that, right? So how do you have these societies where police are allowed to go around? Clearly people are in some ways violating the law. There are people who take it to different levels, but you don't get to the stage where, like in America, where you just every day you're hearing about another person getting killed. This guy's at a Burger King. This guy was a kid. This guy was a violin player. You know, like these are innocent people, and it's over policing that's causing their death. You know, and you know, you can, a lot of times people want to debate, well, this person maybe made a mistake, this person chose the wrong thing to do during a police encounter. We can have those discussions, but I'd rather have that discussion if the person was alive. I would rather tell a young person, you know what, that was stupid what you did. That was crazy that you didn't stop when that cop did, you know, told you to stop. But I'd rather have that conversation in real life, you know, and like, that's what we don't get to have. You know, we literally are like debating after a 10-year-old is shot because he had a fake weapon, you know, and that's what we need to consider when we're funding these police organizations, because they're not going to stop doing what they're doing until we tell them to stop, you know.
So this is my personal question. Do you know of any changes in like what you are like able to ask for when you're arrested with regard to COVID? I know I heard a lot of stories of like mass arrests after protests, and people were held in small spaces. Nobody was provided a mask, things like that. Like, is there anything that we know of with
I
regard to
don't know. I'm not aware of the changes that were made as far as arresting procedures. What I do know is that people were arrested. Well, when the curfew came in, there were people who were arrested as basically the curfew sort of affected the protests a lot. Like people who were not part of the protests technically were not supposed to be stopped, even if they were out after curfew. But there were people. I read an article about one guy who was arrested. He was an essential worker, and he literally was just in the same area as a protest, but he was leaving work and he got arrested, and he ended up spending, I think, a week in jail because you know, they have lack of courts, that like everything is shut down. So there's less court process. Everything is taking longer. And, you know, like we mentioned before, generally you get arrested, you're back out within 24 days. They're not allowed to hold you more than 72 days. But in this current situation, I don't know if they're making those adjustments to get people out quickly, you know. I wish I had more information, but I don't.
And then there's another question. Can you provide us with any information regarding how police are trained? Do they need a bachelor's degree? Like, what does that process look like?
I don't have full information. I know that there's a police training academy. I know that they have to have, it was 2 years before, they had to at least have 2 years of college. And I'm not sure if it all had to be, you know, like police training. Like, I'm not sure if they could just have a regular degree and go through police administration. But there is a requirement for education, but it's not 4 years. That's one of the questions that people have asked, is maybe we could have higher requirements for cops. And that's a suggestion that I think does make some sense. You know, because obviously when you have more requirement, you have people who are a little more thoughtful and have more of a chance to review their actions. But other than that, I think that that's the only requirement, is 2 years, and that you fulfill whatever the police academy requires you to do, which is physical training and, you know, going through the curriculum. The curriculum is updated very regularly, and so I do think they've made some changes as far as how policing is supposed to happen, but it's a problem. You know, like even with de Blasio, who was elected under the idea that he understood stop and frisk. You know, he was literally elected because he understood that stop and frisk was wrong, and he kind of championed that as an issue. And he did make some changes as far as stop and frisk. The city did change, but as far as accountability of officers, it's been very woeful. Holding officers to account, arresting them when they're clearly caught on video doing stuff has been a problem. I'm not sure if there was an officer who was pushing a woman during this protest that was caught on videotape. I think he was suspended, but a lot of times these officers don't get fired. You know, like even Daniel Pantaleo, after 4 years of everybody saying about Eric Garner, he was still on the force. He was only fired several months ago and received who knows how many hundreds of thousands from the police unions, which are allowed to offer support. So he could have raised enough money for the rest of his life, but was still getting paid, you know. And these are the things that we have in New York. It's like the lack of accountability. So they make a lot of changes in the administrative guides and the police handbooks. They've changed the chokehold law and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, it's deeper than that. It's deeper, you know, and so, but it's good that people are active and creating that change. Go ahead.
So the police can hold you for 24 hours without charging you, and then, but with COVID, that's been changed. Just kind of some clarification on that.
Okay, so my understanding was that if you were arrested, the police could hold you for between 24 and 72 hours before they had to charge you or let you go. Now, in this current situation, I don't know if they can hold you for longer, if there's been an extension on that time. I'm really not sure. That's probably something we should talk to like legal aid about, you know, and they might have information there. I know a number of these sites actually have information on their sites, so it might be good to check out. Legal aid and also New York Civil Liberties Union is very important. They do a lot of advocacy work. ACLU might have information.
Great. Are there any other questions for Jabril right now? Lots of people seem like they have to hop off.
Okay, great. I would just add at the last thing that there's a section where we sort of talk about the community's response. Yeah. And, you know, I've been involved in a bunch of organizations that have been working. There's like Latino organizations, there are LGBT organizations, there are Jewish organizations and Asian organizations. there's so many people around the world that want to see this change. You know, like even with George Floyd, like to see how it went everywhere shows that we all have these problems, you know, and I'm glad to talk to people from, you know, folks here who've been in the Ukraine, who are probably experiencing even the same level of problems. And, you know, I just really suggest that people look for organizations that are doing these things and try to get involved. You know, some of them on my list, maybe a little older because we printed this a while ago, but definitely like the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Legal Aid Society, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Justice Committee. And then there's also another organization in New York, which I'm not sure I mentioned before, but it's called, the website is Change the NYPD. And it's basically, the name of the organization is Communities United for Police Reform. I've been part of that organization for about 10 years. And it was one of the main organizations that was involved in the lawsuit against Stop and Frisk, and you know, resulted in them changing the laws. So it really does take people like having a long-term commitment to seeing these things happen. And you know, I feel like it's every generation is going to have to deal with these problems. So it's good for us to know what's happening, you know, and you know, spread the information about knowing your rights, even if it's not something happening to you. You can tell a young person, hey, next time you get stopped, you know, make sure that you know, you're free to go. Ask them if you're free to go. That could save somebody's life. You know, these are very little things, but they actually do have the power to save people's lives and to save people the power for their freedom too. You know, people who are trying to go to school and advance themselves, because these legal charges have long-term consequences. So I think everybody, I know we've been on for a while and it's hot. So feel free to follow up in the best way possible. My information is hopefully posted if people want to email.
Thank you, Jabril. Thank you so much. I mean, what an amazing opportunity to really hear all of the incredible work that you've done, and to have this like really intimate conversation with someone with your depth of knowledge. So we're very, very grateful. The vice president of the New York City Peace Corps Association is on the call with us today. So I want to toss it over to Nicole to wrap us up.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just want to echo that. Thank you so much, Jabril, for all this information. And I really appreciate the space, and that it was very conversational as well for people to ask their questions. And for everyone who joined us today, as Jabril mentioned, you know, we can all be supporting our larger community in terms of sharing these messages and getting the word out. And, you know, we'll be continuing from the organization's perspective, we'll be continuing to look at and sharing resources like this, and continuing to figure out how to connect virtually and keep these conversations active and as part of our work. So thanks again. And if anyone ever has feedback, we're always happy to hear it. You can email us at rpcv.nyc@gmail.com, and I'll just put that in the chat as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jabril.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.